This conference will now be recorded.
We're going to wait a few minutes to give people just a few minutes to a chance to get on the webinar. So we'll start in about 2 minutes. Thanks for being here. Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is David Meyers. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, and really appreciate you joining this webinar. We are all going through a very difficult time globally and probably personally, and it's nice to be able to get together and talk about different ideas, and we hope that you enjoy the webinar and that you enjoy the white paper. So let me, just as a precursor, we have a few of the authors here, and I'm going to probably call on them at random times during the presentation that myself and John Bohorquez will be giving the main parts to. We also have Max Riva on and Ray Victurine. And so I'll be calling on the two of you guys to speak up at different times. And we had another call earlier today that had a few other of the authors on. So we will be covering quite a bit of information, but we'll have probably at least 25 minutes for questions. So while you're on, if you think of something, a question, just jot it down, or you can type it into the chat box, and then we'll go through, and after we're done with the presentation, we'll call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and ask the question that you have. So sort of writing a question in the chat box is kind of like raising your hand, and we look forward to a very interesting discussion at the end. So on that note, let me begin the presentation. This webinar is based on the white paper that the CFA recently released. And just a quick background on the Conservation Finance Alliance. It's a global professional alliance for conservation finance experts, practitioners, and organizations. It's been around since about 2002. It's a hosted organization. Currently, we're hosted by the Wildlife Conservation Society. Our mission is to promote awareness, expertise, and innovation in conservation finance globally. We have 4 working groups and a range of task forces. The working groups are protected area finance, environmental funds, innovation, which is focused on the Conservation Finance Alliance incubator, which is a virtual incubator that's an exciting new activity. And the last one is a relatively recent one, the Marine and Coastal Finance Working Group. If you would like to join them, please sign up on the web pages online. We also work with practice standards for conservation trust funds. That's under revision, as well as a 10-year review of CTFs. We obviously produce white papers, and other reports, and we have trying to up the number of webinars that we're doing because everyone's at home, and we think this is a great way to communicate. So if you do have suggestions for webinar, please let us know, and we'll do our best to get that on. So as I mentioned, the white paper is downloadable for free on the website, and it's has quite a bit of information. And we're going to be touching on some of the main points here. And what this all comes from, to a certain extent, is that over the years, conservation finance has been addressing a range of different issues, and but historically, most definitions have really focused on the part that's around raising money, generating revenue. And the work that we did together with Biofin over the last few years showed that there's different ways of reducing that finance gap. Not only can you increase resources by generating revenue or realigning existing expenditures towards something positive, but also you can decrease your resources needed by, avoiding harmful subsidies, by strategically investing to avoid future expenditures. So, for example, avoiding the introduction of invasive alien species, and then also by delivering better, more efficiency, more effectiveness from the revenue streams that we currently have. So that could reduce the finance gap, but also we do need to raise revenue, and we know that there's money needed. This is estimates. These are old estimates. The one on the left comes from the Global Canopy program that came out back in 2014, I think, something like that. So that's the sort of available financing is on the left is about 52 billion, although current studies are underway, and it's going to be shown that it's quite higher than that. The estimated need has been estimated by a range of people, but at least $400 billion a year is what is needed, and so we're really at a fraction of what we need. So we know that we need to spend more money on nature, no doubt about that. But there's other ways of thinking about it, and we'll get into that in a little bit. I just want to point out that what we know of the sources of finance for nature, for the most part, at least 50% is direct domestic budget allocation, and if you add the additional 15%, which is agricultural subsidy reform, something like that, and this data again comes from the Global Canopy program, quite old, but quite useful. It shows that for the most part, the governments are huge contributors to nature conservation. ODA is at 12%. Green commodities and other kinds of market-based solutions are about 13%, and it just goes to show quite a diversity of sources and quite a predominance of money coming from national governments. So the main messages we want to convey, and we want you to take home from the paper, and we'll try to emphasize them as well in the webinar, is that more money for conservation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Just by increasing the amount of money we're investing in nature, that's not going to solve the problems, because the problems and challenges that nature has are systematic. They're systemic. They're caused in a way by the sort of underlying economic realities of the fact that nature is generally a public good, that private interests generally direct people to over-harvest, whereas public welfare, public needs are often difficult to monetize and difficult to finance. So given that structural complexity of the challenges, if we don't take a holistic approach where we work both sides of the equation, trying to reduce the costs as well as increasing the cash flows so that you achieve a situation where resources available equals the resources required in the long run, to establish systems that are resilient, self-sustaining, self-financing, and able to function in the long term, we will not achieve the goal. You can double, triple, quadruple the amount of money going to nature conservation if you don't spend an equal amount of effort to try to reduce the investments that are going towards harming nature. massive investments in agricultural expansion result in deforestation, for example. So meanwhile, we want to stop deforestation, but we're investing hugely in expanding agriculture directly or without even thinking about it. So defining conservation finance. A lot of the definitions in the past have been really focused on generating and managing. And so our definition here we're proposing is mechanisms and strategies that generate, manage, and deploy financial resources and align incentives to achieve nature conservation outcomes. So not only is it generating, managing, but it's also deploying how we spend that, how we allocate that money, and also aligning incentives. Again, and the aligning incentives part is a really big part of getting it right for the long term, because if we can use conservation finance tools like economic instruments, for example, to align the interests of private sector and public sector, of individuals and groups, this is a long-term solution. So generating resources, again, we've been focused on that a lot. Managing the resources has to do with, like, for example, conservation trust funds manage those resources. Governments manage them in different ways. Deploying them is about how you spend them, where they're allocated, what activities you choose. Are they the most cost-effective? Are they efficient? Are we being careful with our money? And then aligning incentives covers a whole range of different activities. So another way to look at these are with these four sort of blocks here. On the top, you have issues related to money. On the left is decreasing the cost of conservation. If you could reduce the pressures on protected areas, you would really reduce the costs of managing those protected areas. In many cases, decreasing these costs by reducing pressure is easier than trying to raise more capital for conservation, which is the box on the top right. So there's ways of looking at it from a money perspective. There's ways below to look at it from a behavioral perspective. On the left is trying to discourage harmful actions by putting in place fines, penalties, things like that. And on the right is creating incentives for positive action, giving tax break for conservation easements and other kinds of ways to produce blended finance and incentivize the private sector to get into conservation. So again, sort of the ones on the left are about decreasing the negative, the ones on the right increasing the positive, and every situation is going to have probably a different mix of these things. If you could come up with a finance solution, for example, that addresses all four of these at the same time as some perhaps green taxes do, then you really come a long way towards achieving that your goal. And throughout all of this, better delivery, more efficient use of funding really is important. So another model that's worth thinking about is that a finance instrument or finance tool is not an instrument or a mechanism doesn't really stand alone. You have to think about different elements of that finance mechanism or solution. For example, the finance source. Where does the money originally come from? Is it households? Is it businesses? Is it government through taxation? That kind of thing. And then oftentimes there's multiple instruments involved. Maybe the government issues money to a protected area agency that then subcontracts out to a local nonprofit, for example, through a grant. So this instrument one could be a budgetary allocation. Instrument two could be a government grant. There could be some direct money, challenge funds, things like that. And then the beneficiary or whatever will make some actions generating the conservation results that ultimately is what the finance source is interested in. Every finance mechanism, or almost all of them, has a kind of economic model underlying it. There are beneficiaries, there are those that may not win, and you need to think about the opportunity costs and things like that. But what are the economics behind the solution that you're proposing? And this is a sort of generic model that can be applied to a whole range of mechanisms. This complicated diagram is something we're not going to get into, but I just wanted to put it up there to talk about how you would go about identifying finance opportunities, challenges, and how you would try to use your knowledge and use an understanding of economic drivers and political economy and things like that to try to understand who are your stakeholders, who are your decision makers, how would you choose a mix of finance solutions to address the challenges or opportunities, and then how you would go ahead and implement those over time. So that's something you could have a look at in the paper. The one point I do want to make, though, is that it's so much easier in many times to take an existing instrument and source, the bottom left box here, and try to grow to grow that. Say you have protected area entrance fees and it's not generating much revenue. You could consider increasing those prices. You can consider adding different activities on that, to try to look at the different uses of the different sites, things like that, to increase the revenue generated, for example. And that's that you have the capacity ready to do that. These are things that should be prioritized. You may want to add a new source of financing, a new type of donor, like try to get some private sector companies interested in what you're doing. That's slightly challenging, but if you add a new instrument, the bottom right, that again requires different capacity. Oftentimes it takes a lot longer to put in place than you think. And the top right is when there's a new source and a new instrument. And oftentimes we see shiny new opportunities, and we hear green bonds, and everyone wants to do a green bond or a blue bond. These things are complicated. They take time. If you're going to do them and you achieve success with them, you could generate a whole new range of resources, and it's definitely worth trying. But be aware of the time constraints, manage everyone's expectations well, and make sure you have the right capacity. I'm going to pause now and pass it over to Johnny Bohorquez, who was a co-author of the paper. Johnny, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. So a major part of this paper was what we call our taxonomy of conservation finance mechanisms as a structured organization or breakdown that encompasses a diversity of financial mechanisms out there. So what's the benefit, first of all, of breaking down conservation finance mechanisms in this manner? First of all, it can help us produce here a knowledge tool that for anyone who's looking to potentially get a ground-based understanding of different conservation financial mechanisms potentially at their disposal, or to research one particular type. You can get a basic knowledge from what we've provided here, and we've also taken great care to make sure we include informative case examples within each one, as well as refer to broader sources as necessary or as applicable. Secondly, this provides knowledge not just on the mechanisms themselves, but a clear taxonomy can also help understand how these different mechanisms work, as well as the relationships, as well as potential overlap across different approaches or categories. And we acknowledge that while we do try to segment these as best as possible, there is some overlap among the taxonomic groups of conservation finance mechanisms that we've included here. Another important thing to work out to address before we work through these different taxonomic groups is to understand that these mechanisms seldom function on their own as part of a broader conservation finance solution or strategy. They're usually combined in some manner, and a mix of solutions can be the key to a successful conservation finance solution. Dave, next slide, please. Thanks. So these are the higher level. We have 7 higher level categories, or classes, we call them, of conservation finance mechanisms. The first is return-based investments, which encompasses more of the traditional financial approaches you might see from financial institutions around the world across a variety of sectors, including lending, debt, equity, capital markets, basically investments with the expectation of some sort of financial return. The second is economic instruments, which is leveraging potential tools like, for example, environmental taxes, tradable resource quotas, things like that that are important, that can help raise funds for conservation, but also very importantly help influence positive behavior and minimize harmful behavior. We have grants and other transfers that include a variety of pretty well-known conservation finance mechanisms, including, say, for example, philanthropy, and other examples of giving, like besides donations, like ODA or official development assistance from multilateral or bilateral institutions. We have business and markets that includes businesses that take sustainable practices, for example, supply chain sustainability. Public financial management encompasses what we see as more like the traditional governmental support, for example, government annual budgetary spending, but can also include some more alternative or at least lesser known types of government-based mechanisms that we'll review some examples of. We also have risk management that can include insurance structures, as well as blended finance, and financial efficiency that includes, of course, management effectiveness, but also includes other mechanisms that can help either reduce costs or make more efficient use of resources, like public-private partnerships. So to give you a scope here, we have 7. On the left, we have these higher level classes, so which we have a total of 7. On the right, just to give you a sense of the breadth of what we've encompassed here, we have about 34 categories within these classes. We will go into some of these here. Obviously, we don't have time to go into all of them, but just wanted to provide some perspective here on what we're working on, what we're encompassing, and it's something good to potentially take a screenshot of for later use. So our first example is return-based investments. We have Max Riva here. Max, would you like to chime in for a second on this category?
Sure, and good evening or good morning, everyone. I'm not sure where you are based right now. Thank you for the opportunity. And just a few words about return-based investment. To some extent, this is one of the category that has attracted more attention, despite, if you wish, in volumes, to be still one of the smallest in terms of contribution. Here, the view was actually about the potential and to speak over what David said in a way to change behavior and to hit the long run. So how basically investment strategies and financial institutions could actually be used to upscale the early work of NGOs and different kind of quasi-public organizations have done in connecting businesses that may return resources at profit with conservation outcomes. Only very lately, thanks to the boom of impact investing and those all different strategies, has created quite unique opportunity for the conservation space. To some extent, the idea is to follow what happened to solar panels, if you wish, that were almost considered unviable and financially not returning resources, to one of the almost commodities and investment commodities that is today. So the question has always been, how does work in nature? And of course, this is an evolving field. It's still very small, about 3%. It was estimated from last year survey from the Global Impact Investment Network. So we are still speaking about billions. So it is not irrelevant, but it's still very small. And here some of the examples that are referred, including, for example, Altelia Mirova is where large institutions, financial institutions. Altelia Mirova is one of the outfit of Natixis, which is a large wealth management institutions, but also Credit Suisse and other banks. So what has happened is, like, some of the early initiatives, some of those funds, impact funds, are 20 years old, were turned into larger financial products. The coverage and the typology of those different instruments vary much, as was said before, from microfinance type of initiative, green microfinance for farmers and different types attached to technical assistance provision, and different how to diversify income structure and make them sustainable, to a bit more market-oriented instruments. And what has happened most lately, and even into bonds, as in Latin America, a report was launched just last year, and land-based bonds were actually one of the growing issuances in Latin America. So it's to summarize this and to give back the floor to David and John. The headline is like there is a variety of new investors that are interested in impact markets, and those impact markets value nature-based businesses. And that nature-based businesses have the potential to create biodiversity outcomes. So that has been the news and a bit of the storyline. You can find examples here. Also, David mentioned the CFA US initiatives as in terms of supporting new enterprises and initiatives. And there are many others. In the last year, we just counted 15, and probably now there are more than 20 initiatives, either as aggregators, either as business incubators that can help this to grow. I will stop here and give back the floor to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Max. The next class of conservation finance mechanisms that we want to give some examples of here is economic instruments. As I mentioned before, economic instruments is a really important class here that encompasses kind of the overarching philosophy or theory for this paper. That is, how can we look beyond conservation finance as simply raising revenue, but also in some cases reducing costs or reducing harmful behavior or encouraging positive behavior on behalf of the environment. This includes green taxes as a type of environmental tax. It can include tourism entrance fees, which, while traditionally seen as a way to raise revenue for conservation activity, can in some cases, as appropriate, be used to help reduce the amount of tourist traffic in cases where tourist volume may actually be harmful to the environment. And another example as a form of resource quotas here that can help encourage stewardship of the environment is tradable fisheries quotas. Grants and other transfers. This is, as I mentioned, has some pretty well-known sources of financing. It encompasses private and corporate philanthropy. As an example,
Johnny, maybe we could bring Ray in here at this point, yeah, to see if
yeah, absolutely.
If you're Ray, if you're on, maybe talk about this and the next topic, or actually the next one I'll cover.
Okay. Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Ray Victurine from WCS. I'm not sure exactly the points you wanted to cover here, but this part is, I mean, much of the funding for conservation still takes place because of private and corporate philanthropy. It's a major source of funding. It's a source that we hope will continue, certainly, and it's one that can work to support conservation just on its own, or can obviously be a tremendous source of leverage for other types of mechanisms. As David said, one of the things that we try to stress is that there should not be just one mechanism that, oh, we're going to solve all our problems by coming up with a single mechanism. That there are different approaches that we need to take, and how can we use private and corporate philanthropy along with economic instruments and other aspects to be able to generate sufficient funding and more resilient funding to ensure that we can meet our conservation objectives. I was just thinking about John talking about tourism, and so many places have developed really, how would I say, very robust tourist attractions that are now empty and may be for quite some months, and that's going to have significant impact on the management of certain protected areas, for example. One of the other areas that has been sort of a major aspect of conservation finance is that donors have put quite a bit of funding into conservation trust funds. There's an estimate of between $1 billion, $1.5 billion of money in conservation trust funds, and these institutions not only fund conservation, but are established as strong institutions within the countries where they operate, contributing to policy, contributing to the range of issues that were outlined in the earlier slides. So it's not just raising money, it's trying to make things more efficient, try to come up with broader solutions. So, I mean, I'm sure right now many of those funds are reeling as the stock market is getting, buffeted by the virus, but still those funds are set up to last in perpetuity, to be there to provide capital and inputs to help stimulate other investment. And there's a lot of sharing of information. The Latin American funds have a network called REDLAC. There's a fund there's one in Africa, which is called CFA. There's one that's nascent in Asia called AppNet, and they're all set up to be able to share information. And then the CFA is very engaged in developing different toolkits and guidance to make the management of these conservation trust funds as robust as possible. So I'll stop there, David, and pass on the next slide then.
Thanks, Ray. Johnny, I'm just going to take over this one because we had a nice presentation from Anno van der Heuvel earlier from Biofin, talking about a couple examples from the Philippines, which is really, really interesting. There was basically a system of protected areas, if you will, throughout the Philippines that were more or less protected areas in theory, and it turned out from a study of Biofin that they had not been actually gazetted, and therefore they were not receiving any kind of government finance. And a Congresswoman, Josephine Ramirez Sato, was really pushed a great initiative for legislation to gazette these protected areas. So the number of gazetted protected areas in 2018 went from 13 to 107. And new regulations were adopted in 2019. And then finally in 2020, even though the protected areas were official now, they actually hadn't had any budget allocated, and the government, the Parliament proposed, Congress proposed the creation of a budget for those protected areas of $46 million. So, just this is a great example of the importance of government budgeting, the importance of regulation, and how central governments are just essential for conservation. The next example, payment platform with Gcash, is a public-private partnership that is built around using an app for various things, and you can do activities. I'm probably going to get some of this wrong, but you can do activities on the app, such as switching to paperless billing and things like that. You get points that grow a tree on your app, and when the tree is fully grown on your app, then a tree is actually planted on your behalf. And so this was launched in 2019. It's growing. It's quite popular from what I am told. And they had initial contribution of $500,000, and they're planting trees in different key watersheds in the Philippines to try to stabilize those watersheds. So really interesting ideas that have come out of Biofin projects. And back to you, Johnny.
Thanks, Dave. The next taxonomic class we'd like to talk a little bit about here is public financial management. This can include fiscal transfers, government grants, like for example the conservation innovation grants by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that help support small emerging initiatives or technologies similar to what a conservation incubator might do. We also have earmarking revenues for nature in this category, which can include, for example, gasoline taxes, which in Costa Rica have been used to support a national payment for ecosystem services program that has been a really positive influence and support for reforestation efforts around the country. The point here in choosing these examples is that, again, while traditional domestic government spending is included here, these are examples of some perhaps lesser known mechanisms that are government supported that have the potential to be utilized. And the last of the taxonomic classes that we provide some examples of here, we only have time to provide, I think, examples of 5 of the total 7 classes, is financial efficiency. By financial efficiency, we mean reducing costs or making most efficient use of the resources available. Some examples can include mainstreaming biodiversity in development. One example of that has been the Working for Water program in South Africa that has helped make invasive plant species a consideration within all national environmental legislation. Another example is public-private partnerships. In this case, a government agency that might typically be held responsible for managing protected areas can use public-private partnerships to reduce their costs or offset some of the management or fundraising responsibility for a protected area. In many examples, like for example, Stanapa that manages the Bonaire National Marine Park, specialize in one particular location or country, but African Parks is a pretty unique example here in that not only have they been around for 20 years, but they have also amassed what you could really call a portfolio of protected areas that they manage, of about 17 protected areas in 11 different countries. So a very unique example there. And lastly, we also want to mention that, of course, these taxonomic classes were inspired by different sources that are available for future research or for expanded research on conservation finance and conservation finance mechanisms that we certainly encourage you to reach out to. One example is the BioFin catalog, which has 168 different examples of financial instruments. The CFA website is also a wealth of information, including specifically the CFA guidebook on conservation finance mechanisms that we're also currently updating. We'd also like to acknowledge the UNDP Financing Solutions for SDGs, as well as the OECD PINE database that was particularly influential for our economic instruments.
Great, thanks, Johnny. And I think we'll close up right now, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Just a couple. While you're thinking of your questions, just going to go over this last slide. And how are we going to use this taxonomy and this definition, and what's the value of where we're going in the future with this? As Johnny mentioned, one is the Conservation Finance Guide is being updated. We're structuring it according to these taxonomic groups. We are looking through those 160 plus mechanisms in the BioFin catalog to see and showing where they fit throughout this whole thing. There's a whole range of efforts right now underway to try to measure how much money is going into conservation or biodiversity and what are the finance needs. And we think that the definition and the theory behind it, as well as the taxonomic categories, could be very useful for structuring that and making sure we don't ignore key areas. And then, maybe even in the future, you could define specific objectives within each different class, or like of the 7 large classes, or the 34 or so different categories underneath. But we really hope that you've appreciated the white paper, and look forward to any questions you might have. We've got about 20 minutes left, and if you put a question into the chat box, we can then suggest that you open up your mic, and we will let you ask your question directly. But while you're thinking of that, maybe I'll I'll open this up again to Ray and Max. If you could perhaps share some general thoughts on the white paper and the meaning of the new definition. Maybe over to you, Max, to start.
Yeah, sure. And thanks, David. By the way, I failed to introduce myself. I'm now working as investment advisor to the UN Joint SDG Fund, which is a large grant-making facility looking at how to expand SDG financing along developing countries. But in the previous 5 years, I worked mostly on conservation finance and biodiversity finance with Biofin and other initiatives. To me, it was quite this initiative was quite timely as there were many attempts to try to figure out what works, what did not work. There were several names being used to indicate the same things, but in order to try to systematize the information, categorize the numbers, try to come up with actual figures on impact of the different solutions and mechanisms. This was kind of lacking as a basic definitions. And I think even if it may seem as an initial step, I think this attempt to firm up a taxonomy and to attach it with numbers and with cases can be useful into take stock of what has been done in the several years. And I think this also highlights the interest of several alliances and groups that may focus on a specific subgroup of mechanisms, but that we need to see the universality of it. And I'm not sure exactly how we can improve forward, but that's to me is some of the important use of this paper, and we hope that it can also spur research and the other efforts of others to contribute.
Excellent, thank you, Max. Greatly appreciate it, and maybe over to Ray for maybe a final. We don't seem to be getting any questions, which is absolutely fine. But maybe Ray, you could also just share some of your thoughts on the topic, and over to you.
Sure. Well, I guess one of the things that we wanted to do with the paper was to help people in terms of looking at different options in terms of what's realistic for their situation. There's been so much talk about impact investing and all this money that's available from impact investing, when in fact it may be quite difficult to organize those kinds of programs, or to find projects that actually will give a return at the same time that they're providing good conservation outcomes. So what we really wanted to do was begin to say, okay, here's the situation. How do you analyze what your options might be? What kind of opportunities really do exist? What's happening in your country that could become a source of financing? If you're a country where there's a lot of investment in infrastructure or extractive industries, should you be looking at the role of the private sector and then both trying to reduce your impacts? Again, this is requiring you to spend less on conservation actions, and then come up with compensation mechanisms. And as you require that, as you put that into law, then do you create markets like we have in the US or Australia and other places? So what we wanted to do is get people to think about the role of government in terms of creating market opportunities, to help in terms of generating resources that will flow toward conservation, and then looking at the different opportunities that can be put together as a package to generate the kind of finance that will make a difference, and put together a sort of a plan, like a sort of overall plan that takes different types of mechanisms and employs them in a way that then generates resources. So the idea is to try to stimulate some of that thinking, look at the different opportunities, and then using the other resources that will be available, the Conservation Finance Alliance, to be able to really do the analysis needed to choose what's the best approach, and sort of not get caught up in sort of, oh, this new shiny object, which may be the best thing, but in reality, some real basic mechanism is the right thing for your program or for your country or for your region. And hopefully this paper will help people in their thinking around those types of issues. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ray. Really great points. I think that, you know, if there's one thing that seems to keep coming back to me with all this work, is the central role that government plays in many of these different tools. So, you know, basically, even for you know, or return-based investing, the government has to create a good environment for the private sector, for investments, a capital market, things like that, that facilitate investments in general. And then, of course, all the economic instruments, you know, government plays a critical role in that, but in quite a range of different tools, you do need government to come in and create markets, create, you know, asset classes, and create structures that can facilitate, you know, sound environmental management, upon which a lot of these finance structures are based. You know, so just another point that I think is often overlooked, to the detriment of coming up with good solutions. So it seems that it's either too early in the morning for places, or too late at night for others. We haven't had any questions, so I'm more than happy to say thank you to everyone, and for joining, and thank you for being interested in the white paper. We hope you read it and enjoy it, and share it broadly. And please reach out to us if you have any thoughts or questions. If you're inclined to join one of our working groups, please do so. And we have calls, each working group has calls about once a quarter, some more frequently. And we look forward to you. Oh, we have another webinar coming up, I think on April 8th, and that's going to be about SECAT, the Seychelles Climate Change Conservation Trust. So don't miss that, and you'll find information on that at the website. And on that note, want to thank you very much for being part of this, and wish you all a wonderful day and a wonderful evening. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, David. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.